Johann Hari is. I think that's how you pronounce his name. Johann is the first name. Last name Hari. He has been causing quite a stir in a kind of a rather positive way in the addiction world by claiming that everything we know about addiction is wrong. And essentially, connection and unconditional love are the answers to addiction. Something strikes me as I resonate with that. So I'm not here to pick on him at all. But I've been reading his work, and I think what he's doing is he's kind of pointing us in a good direction. The problem, though, is that when people have theories, they think that that's the only thing that's contributing, or they put all their eggs in one basket. So if he's correct that connection and unconditional love are the antidote to addiction, for example, what about trauma? So the science says that trauma is a major driver of addiction, and I would say other things are major drivers to addiction. Self-limiting beliefs, deficiency stories, shame, emotional repression. There's science behind emotional repression and trauma being connected to addiction. And even though I haven't seen any studies connecting self-limiting beliefs to addiction, that goes with repression. Because when we repress ourselves, our thoughts and feelings, we normally have a self-limiting belief right there, a deficiency story, right there with it. So follow me here, because once you can see what the drivers are, let's go back to what Hari says. If I have to repress anger or fear as a child, that becomes part of my personality. I then transfer that to every other relationship. So in relationship, then I'm repressing emotion and thought as a way to get along, to get love, to stay safe, protect myself. This repression often comes from trauma. So in the face of a parent or someone when you were a kid scaring you or doing something else, bullying you, you repressed emotion as a part of that trauma. So when science says that trauma is a driver, they are also saying, in fact, there are independent studies saying that emotional repression goes with trauma and is also a driver under addiction. So that's science, and we probably shouldn't ignore that. But what Hari seems to be saying is that, I don't know if he's actually saying this, but one implication of what he's saying is that we don't have to do trauma work in order to recover from addiction. I don't know if he's saying that. There have been some who've said that that's what he's saying, essentially that all we need is unconditional love and connection, and that heals the addiction in someone. But in fact, all these things tie themselves together. They're all tied together. The disconnection that we experience in relationship with other people is tied directly to the trauma and to the emotional repression. They're all connected. They're all connected. With trauma in childhood, we become disconnected from ourselves and from each other. We essentially reject ourselves in trauma, therefore repressing thoughts and feelings, rejecting self, feeling rejected, and disconnecting from others. That's really the nature of trauma. And from that, there's often repression. So you can see how disconnection in relationship is tied to trauma and is tied to repression. So they're all involved in addiction. There's a way to tie it all together, actually. When I was in sixth grade, I just got done being bullied pretty badly by my best friends in sixth grade. So my best friends sort of turned on me, with one ringleader doing most of it and encouraging the rest of them to ridicule, hit me, chase me, ignore me, call me names, be mean, get me in trouble, all those things. So those were my best friends. Who needs enemies, right? What I noticed after that is I was in a barn, actually. I think it was during the summer after being bullied. I was in a barn with two new friends, Eric and David. And Eric and David weren't involved in bullying me. They went to different schools. They didn't even know what was going on. And I was too ashamed to talk about it. But I struck up a friendship with Eric and David as like a safe harbor away from the friends who were bullying me. And I remember, though, that Eric didn't stay in town too much long. So I met Eric and David like in June. And then by August, Eric was moving out of town. His parents were moving him to Texas. During the time of getting to know them, though, they were my only lifeline during a period of time where I was being ferociously bullied. And again, I was too ashamed to tell them about that. But I remember that David introduced me to tobacco, and that was in sixth grade in that summer, chewing tobacco. And of course, I remember getting high off of it, but I have distinctly have the memory of when I took the tobacco, when I put it in my mouth. It felt like I had a friend, and that friend made me feel good. And although I wasn't aware of it, that friend took the place of my other friends. So I sensed that Eric was moving out of town, and I could sense that my connection with them was fleeting. It wasn't going to last. And I'd already lost my connection to my best friends. So I was a very alone, scared child, feeling unsafe in the world. So tobacco couldn't bully me, couldn't ridicule me, couldn't hit me, and in fact would make me feel good every time. So it was the disconnection of that trauma and the holding back of all those feelings and thoughts, the repression. It was that created or started that addiction. And I would say it started the rest of the addictions because not long after that, I started smoking weed and drinking, and eventually then painkillers and cocaine, meth, crack, all of that. It's one thing to tell someone that their recovery should involve connection and unconditional love. It's a completely another thing about how do you do that. It seems like we have to do a much deeper dive than just very surface level things that say, as long as we just love somebody, that's going to love them out of addiction or out of their suffering. It goes deeper than that. With the somatic work that we're doing with KI, we come to learn that on the somatic level, there are usually a host of programs which are very disconnecting. Trauma-based programs and commands, things like, I'm not safe. I don't trust other people. I have to hide. I can't connect with other people. Other people are scary. So these programs are running for anybody who's really experienced trauma in their childhood, and I don't mean just bullying or something like that, where it's clear that the event is traumatic, but even relationships, which are disconnecting. A relationship with a father or a mother, which you felt like you weren't loved and accepted or weren't met or they weren't present. That's disconnecting too. And that has the result of programs being stored in the body about how you're unsafe or disconnected or not loved. So these programs, which we call deficiency stories, essentially come from traumatic relationships. And they haunt us for the rest of our lives because they're deeply rooted in the somatic. The one thing that I liked about 12-step program is that there was this connection with people. So I'd go to these rooms and it's like I got to meet people that were like me, people who had almost destroyed themselves with drugs. And they were doing something different and connecting with each other. The support system was incredible. And in fact, I think that's a lot of what kept me clean in the beginning. I had 8 years of sobriety. During that period of time, there was a lot of connection in my life, at least on the surface. What I came to find out later is that deep in the somatic, there were programs that kept me from truly being transparent and authentic with people. There were programs that kept me from truly trusting people or even feeling safe around them. So even the time that I was going to all these meetings and on the surface connecting with people, and it was helping, down deep, there were still these programs of I'm not safe, I can't trust people, I'm not lovable, I have to hide. And these are very, very common programs. Like now, having done so many sessions with people, I've seen them in people all over the world, very similar programs like that, deeply rooted in the somatic. So then there's frustration with people because if they go to these meetings, if they get support from other people who love them, even if that happens, and sometimes you don't even have that. Sometimes people who are addicted don't have those kinds of people around them that will truly love them and accept them unconditionally without judgment or punishment. A lot of people don't even have that. That's a really good start to have that kind of environment. But even the people who do have that can still experience addiction because that in of itself doesn't seem like it's enough. It's a really good start, but it's not enough because as long as we believe in the somatic experience that we can't trust people, that we're not safe, that we're not loved, as long as we believe it, regardless of what's happening, believe these traumatic programs, these deep core wounds, as long as we believe that, we can feel alone and disconnected even in a group of people. Those who carry these programs around. On the surface, you may have connection with people who really, really love you and really, really support you. But again, held in your body is the remembrance of a relationship or relationships or events in your history, things that happened to you that taught you, literally trained you to feel disconnected from people. It's a very smart operating system in the sense that something happens when we're kids, and really unbeknownst to us, a mechanism is created which represses emotion in order to survive that situation and learns, picks up important information from those events or those relationships about how to survive in the future in the face of being with people. So it's not like when I was bullied, I programmed this stuff into my body. I didn't say, okay, now I know I can't trust people, so let me put that program in there. And now I don't really feel safe around people. Let me put that in there as a way to stay safe or to protect myself. Nothing like that. It was encountering an experience in which people dominated me. People bullied and ridiculed and chased and hit me. So that's what happened. And as a result of those events and those relationships, the programming happened very quickly. The body survived that and the mind by literally believing certain things, programs. And it happens like that. You're not even aware of it. But just the fact that you had some relationship like that or event, you should probably look into whether you're storing such programs in your body because you can really be unaware of it. It might show up as like a self consciousness or an anxiousness or a body that's contracted or a heavy heart, a clenched stomach. It could show up as like, yeah, certainly in relationship isolation, relationships that just don't seem to work out, sabotage happening in relationships. There's all kinds of signs of it. But to actually do the deep somatic work is a completely different thing. So you can see the signs and still be lost. You can see the signs of PTSD. You can feel the contracted body. You can feel that anxiousness around people, but you can't get to it. And you can't solve it just by trying to connect because you're trying to override your system. When you connect with people, down deep, your body's saying no to that deep intimate connection. And so something different has to happen, something deeper than just let's connect with people. We have to be able to connect with people. Our programs have to go. The ones held in the body that say, I can't connect. I don't trust people. I'm not safe. There's something wrong with me. All of that has to go if you want to heal from addiction, because those are the programs that keep us feeling disconnected from others, even when we're being loved by them. There can still be a sense of disconnection within us. It may show up with those words. Like if you feel into your body right now, especially where you're holding energy of any kind, and then just look at the people in your life, the important people, pull them up in awareness. As you're feeling into the inner body where these energies are stored, just say, I can connect with everyone. And listen for a response, like an objection of some kind. It could be a thought that comes up. It could be something in the body that activates or flares up when you say that inquiry. That's evidence of disconnection. If you got a response to that, an objection to that inquiry, that's what I mean by the deep core programming. Try that again. Looking, looking at all the important people, feeling into like that stomach that's contracted, that's involved in your addiction, or that heart area, or wherever you feel the longing for something, a drug, alcohol, something, caffeine, food, wherever you feel that longing, feel into that area and look at all the people in your life and just say, I can connect with all of them. And listen. If you got a no or some version of no, then there's your evidence. So if you're addicted to something, that may be one of the main culprits right there. That story of disconnection is programmed in the body. But it doesn't have to be just addiction. I think there are people who are seeking enlightenment and self-improvement and other things in life as a result of this program. The deep sense of disconnection with others. And it may show up in a different way. It may show up as like, I'm unlovable, or I'm not good enough, or there's something wrong with me. And so therefore, that story cannot connect with others because it doesn't really, that story seeks to confirm itself. So it actually reinforces itself by not connecting with others. It reinforces I'm unlovable, reinforces I'm not good enough. And so it continues on unabated because it's somatically deeply held in the body. You may not even be conscious of it in your waking moments very much. You may just feel uncomfortable around others or anxious or like you can't be in your own skin or just a sense of distrust or lack of safety around others, especially in intimate situations where intimacy is called for. There could be an objection to that, a fear coming up, resistance. So there's your work right there. So the body keeps the score, and the score is disconnection. Disconnection is winning the war here, if you've got this story. So when I first discovered that one, and I discovered it under an addiction, I began to inquire into that, and I stayed with that inquiry for quite a while. And the inquiry is I can connect with others. And then the thoughts would say, no, 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 no. And that went on for quite a while. But I'm not even going to tell you, well, I'm going to tell you. When that story was clear, it certainly changed my relationship with the addiction because the addiction was acting as a substitute for the connection that I felt like I'd lost with people. So in doing that very simple inquiry, that sense of disconnection was felt in the body. And then as it was felt, I kept mining out the thoughts that said, I can't connect, just rapidly, kind of over and over. There it is, can't connect, can't connect, can't connect, witnessing it every time. If you don't know how to conjure that up, you might want to learn the Kilby inquiries. It's very easy to conjure it up. But if you don't have the right tools, it can hide from you. And it could show up just as a contraction or anxiousness or something. And you might have no clue that that story is running the show until you do inquiry or pull it up in some way. So essentially, it's the absence of that sense of disconnection, which becomes a doorway to recovery. The absence of that sense of disconnection that's stored in the body, which really means the programs about not being able to connect or not trust people or not feeling safe, whatever that is, they dissolve. And they're not replaced with something else. They simply dissolve. The absence of them changes the way the body feels, and it changes the way the body feels around other people. So, for example, the anxiousness or the contraction won't be there. If you go deeply with this, if your contraction, your body energy is held together, at least in part, by this disconnection, the absence of that would not only mean being able to connect with people, oh, that's a funny word, uh, easier access to intimacy, honesty, transparency, authenticity, that kind of connection where you're not hiding anymore. You're not in the business of hiding your emotions all the time or your shameful stuff. Like having those kinds of relationship where there's real intimacy is usually a sign that there's less addiction or no addiction happening. Certainly less, because that's how connected it all is. So we've known this for decades. We meaning I'm in the treatment field. People in the treatment field have known this through research for decades that support helps. That's how it shows up. Like having people around you who support you helps in recovery, but it just doesn't go deep enough because it's not enough just to have people around you. If quietly within you are resisting a connection with those people, when you're not feeling safe around people, when you're feeling judged around people, when you're having traumatic responses to people, then you could be surrounded with the most loving people in the world. As long as those programs were running, they'll project that onto those people. So even people that are there to support you, you may even push them away. I've seen it happen where somebody's, in an addiction, and the people around them are being very loving and supportive and non-judgmental and non-punishing. But because of the person's trauma, they project something else on those people and then begin to push them away, sabotage the relationships. So it really isn't enough just to be surrounded by people who love you unconditionally. My hat's off to Johan Hari for bringing this up because it is so important, but it just has to go deeper than just surrounding yourself with people who love you, let alone all the people out there that are surrounded by people who are not supporting them, right? So you're lucky if you have that support, but either way, whether you have it or not, there's work to be done. And how your body holds the resistance to relationship, resistance to intimacy, connection. I know this so well because I lived my whole life disconnected from people. From the time I was in sixth grade forward, did not trust people. And for a long time, I wasn't really even aware of it. Someone said to me once, "You don't really like people, do you, Scott?" And I couldn't really say anything because that felt true. But that was just a sign of a long held story of not just about not liking people, but not being able to trust them. Because again, when you have your best friends turn on you, that leaves an imprint and transfers over to other relationships. So just look for it in your own life. But for me, once I was bullied, before I was bullied, I was connecting. Like I was the little kid on the block who liked to challenge everybody to like sports competitions or create a haunted house or dance, invite people over, play basketball, whatever. Just looking to connect everywhere so innocently, so in love with life in a way. And then the bullying happened and everything shifted. I started spending all my time alone in my room playing guitar and making sure that I avoided situations like that, which means just don't have friends. That's one way to avoid that is just don't have friends. And I lived my life like that. Yes, I had friends, but this is just my experience. Yours is going to be different, but you may be able to find certain things in common, and that can give you a path to inquiry. For me, romantic relationships were fine. I didn't have the trigger on that. That didn't scare me in the same way that friendships did. People who are close to you, and then don't let them in. That was the whole thing. Don't let them in. It's been amazing to develop the repression work for people that we're doing because part of what gets repressed for some people is the capacity or the ability to love and connect. So we learn this early in life, whether it's trauma or otherwise, we learn this, that it's safer to not express certain things. And if one of those things that we repress is love, that can be a sign again, like another doorway into seeing how addiction or some other suffering has come in your life, has come to take over your life in some way. So you may be someone who did not reject friends. Don't want you to look at my experience like this is the real template for addiction. You'll have different facts, different relationships, but the thing that we may have in common are these deeply somatic core programs. So we had different upbringings. Maybe you weren't bullied by your best friends. Maybe there was some trauma from your mom and dad or someone else. And so maybe you started to develop distrust in different ways. But look for that. Maybe you're even someone who was really surrounded by people growing up who were really good friends to you. But that doesn't mean that deep inside you didn't feel disconnected. And if you have a deficiency story, and everybody does, then that's disconnection. So it's all connected. The trauma that happens to us in these relationships, that forms as a deficiency story. There's something wrong with me. I'm not safe. I'm not lovable. I'm not good enough. Something like that. And then that story is, by its very nature, disconnecting. Because two deficiency stories can't really connect. So if you're with people and they're operating on deficiency stories, they can't really connect. Not in the deep way, because the story seeks to confirm itself. And the way that it confirms itself is by essentially never getting what you want from other people. Like always feeling like you're lacking, or you can't get enough approval, or enough love, or enough safety from people. It's like a hole that you cannot fill. But that story just wants to fill that hole. It isn't really interested truly in connecting and being intimate with another. It will use that simply to feel no longer deficient, to try to fix the wound. And so it's not therefore interested in genuine connection, it's interested in feeding a story. And so, with the focus being on feeding one's own identity, how is there going to be connection with another person? Especially when the other person is operating on a deficiency story, which also disconnects in relationship. So, this is not only one of the things that we can look at to begin recovering from addiction, but also from all of our relationship issues. Once you really see the deficiency stories cannot connect, if you really, really see that, wouldn't you then become very earnest around that? Wouldn't you really want to let go of that, to see through that? I can't imagine not wanting to see through that once you see it, because of the damage that it creates in our relationships and in our life with addiction and whatever else. There are other forms of suffering that come as a result of this disconnection. Many of the mental health issues, you can say, come at least in part from a sense of disconnection with others. Had I grown up in a way that did not have this stuff happen to me, if I truly had relationships which were nurturing, where there was unconditional love and support, and I was never traumatized, and so therefore my body never kept these imprints, I don't even know whether I'd been interested in spirituality or anything. It was from those things that made me interested in spirituality. It's all conjecture, but what if we raised a child? What if a child was raised where the child never felt deficient? Like the parents were so conscious and the people around them were so conscious that they just wouldn't make that child feel that way in any way. And the child was always loved and always felt safe and trusted people. And actually then had people around him or her. Would that child necessarily grow up to be addicted? I doubt it. Unless there's some genetic thing that overrode all that. Chances are that would have ended differently. That would end differently. But I just don't know any people like that. I've not met one human being yet in all my years of living on the earth, but especially all my years of doing sessions with people one-on-one, where I get to go inside their mind. I see everything that they believe. Never once have I met someone who said, when I was a child, I was loved unconditionally. I never felt deficient. Nobody traumatized me. I always trusted people and felt safe. That human being, that, as far as I know, does not exist. So that leaves us all in the same boat. Some degree of disconnection, which is probably manifesting as addiction, depression, bipolar, and in some cases even chronic pain and illness, because repression is involved. If you really hear me, you might want to turn towards those practices that are directed right at that deficiency story, right? Because remember, that deficiency story was created from the trauma of our past, the relationships, and it's being stored in the body. And that's the source of disconnection. How we define ourselves as limited, like I'm lacking love, I'm not good enough. See, if you really see how that's a culprit behind so much of our suffering, you would focus there. See, I stopped focusing on ego, because ego to me it's a very general term, and it could kind of refer to all the mind movement having to do with self. But the real culprit for me is the deficiency story. It's not just ego. Ego is so all encompassing, but when you get down to deficiency stories, it's very specific. And because it's specific, you can inquire into it skillfully. Ego is very general. So this is why I think that through the years, when people have looked for self or looked for ego, it hasn't always gone deeply. I don't know how to put this in words, but there are so many aspects of the ego that are unconscious. So you could see through a great deal of that ego activity, and a certain amount of it remains. But when you talk about deficiency story, it's very specific. So you can target that so that it doesn't remain. And there's ways of testing that out, whether you still believe in a deficiency story. Whereas testing out whether there's ego consciousness is tricky. because it's not specific. There is no ego. There are just these patterns of thinking, thoughts, words, pictures, feeling, and sensation. That's what we're really experiencing. So we're never going to find an ego. That's the issue, is that there's no thing there. There's just these patterns. So what we're doing with deficiency stories is focusing in on a specific pattern, and that's why it's helpful. A lot can be summed up with regard to addiction by 3 terms: connection, rejection, and repression. Look at how much that covers. Connection is what I've been talking about. When there's a disconnection in our experience with others, that can fuel addiction. And the disconnection often comes from the drivers that science talks about. Trauma can create a sense of disconnection in our experience. Traumatic relationships, not just events, relationships, create the disconnection. And that disconnection continues beyond childhood because we learn these patterns and transfer them to other relationships. So it's like a recipe for feeling disconnected from people for the rest of your life if you don't do the inquiry on it or do some work with it. And then there's rejection, because when we're not connected with others as a kid, we feel rejected. We feel rejected by others, even if it's just our parents. And the rejection goes deep. So it's not just the rejection that we might think of just feeling rejected. It's like someone doesn't pay attention to you, for example, that kind of rejection, or ignoring you or hitting you, doing something, which is a rejection. But it's also a rejection of our thoughts and feelings. So in these traumatic events and relationships, we literally have to, in order to survive that. No, let me don't get to that. Let me not get to that first. When someone is when there's trauma happening in our lives, it's essentially that they're rejecting us, including our thoughts and feelings, and or we reject ourselves, which means we repress the thoughts and feelings in order to survive. So the rejection that we experience in trauma ends up being a rejection of self, rejection of thoughts and feelings, which is repression. So you can see that connection, rejection, and repression are really important when it comes to recovery. Looking into these matters very deeply, how that unfolded for us, looking in inquiry and seeing the origins of it, seeing that whether it started with mom and dad or someone else, we felt like we couldn't be ourselves. At the very least, we felt like we couldn't be ourselves. On top of that, we may have experienced real scary stuff, like angry parents or angry bullies or sexual abuse or something. So we couldn't be ourselves. And in fact, there were parts of ourselves that were absolutely unsafe to show. Some of our feelings, our thoughts, in the face of these relationships, they get rejected. We reject them. We repress them. And by the time we're 13, 14 years old, it's essentially we've rejected our entire self in a way. We've come to believe a false self that isn't even what we are, repressing emotions. A lot of our response becomes a trauma response. Our personalities are essentially, in a way, you could say, trauma responses. So there's a wholesale rejection of self pretty early on when there's trauma. And the key is you don't even really know it because we're too young to get it. We may experience it as feeling like our parents don't love us, or feeling like we're not safe at school, or it'll show up that way, but we don't recognize the wholesale rejection of self that comes from that, including the repression of important feelings and thoughts that we have. So it really isn't a surprise that we have a nation of addiction or an epidemic, because this is how people grow up in this world. This is the status quo. It's an unusual thing to experience someone who didn't go through that in some way. Here's the tricky part, I think, is that as you're listening to me, you may have trouble putting the dots together because you have to understand that trauma is denied and repressed. So it's like a sleeping dog. Just let sleeping dogs lie. It's just there. And because it's repressed and unconscious, we don't see the full impact on that until we see the full impact on that of that. And a lot of times you can't see the full impact until you go deeply within. We can't always see it in our external lives. We can't see it in our relationships. We may see other things. Again, we may feel anxious or self-conscious, or maybe our attention span is all over the place. ADHD. Maybe we're depressed a lot. Maybe you have chronic pain. You see indicia of it, but until you open up to something skillful that shows you the programs, you don't see the impact of what happened to you as a child. I mean, I don't want to assume that about you. Maybe you're someone who was keenly aware of all that from the beginning. I wasn't. So when the awakening happened in 2007, it never had occurred to me to actually look at the bullying because it was a sleeping dog. I certainly didn't have any understanding of the impact of that on my life. I didn't understand that a lot of the seeking of enlightenment came from this disconnection from others and all the suffering that comes with that. Did not have that information, didn't have that insight. So I could just imagine there are a lot of other people right now who are not trauma informed on the path, who may not understand what's driving them. It's not just a desire for truth. That sounds really good, and that's there too. It's really that we're trying to escape our pain. We're being driven by our pain. We may have a desire for the truth too, but the suffering is what really drives this. Sometimes we just don't recognize that a trauma is a driver, though. We don't recognize it until you start doing inquiry. So it's really humbling to admit to you that I had this awakening experience and then didn't know how the trauma was impacting me. And then I go into inquiry and I see on the somatic level these things. Can't trust people, not safe, can't connect with people, can't be intimate. All of that was held in the body. So the awakening was like, whew, done, awake. There is no body, there's no self, there's nothing. It's all just inseparable. And then thinking, oh, that must be it. And no, I'm not alone when I say that's not it. That's like the beginning, in a way. Beginning of exploring the somatic stuff and all these programs that we've downloaded. To me, this is the reason why you see people, and it's very common, having a realization or very powerful shift, and then lo and behold, they're still drinking every day or quite often, or smoking weed all the time or something. No judgment, no shaming, but at least let's talk honestly about what's going on. That the recognition of awareness in and of itself, just the presence practices by themselves, being all that, is not enough to uproot the deep somatic programs. And if you hear that, then you can understand why you've been going to retreats and you have the experience of awareness pretty solid in your experience. And yet, let's talk about your addictions. What addictions have remained beyond that? What addiction is still there when you leave the retreat? Or what condition is still there after hours of meditating, or even days, weeks, months, years of meditating? What patterns are still there? If there are patterns still there, that ought to be a sign that what I'm saying connects with you. That maybe the missing link are these somatic programs, disconnection, rejection of self, repression, which is still there in the body, even though you've woke up to awareness. or you're in the process of waking up to awareness. Thank you, Carolyn. That's her experience too. Have amazing spiritual experiences and even shifts where it's not just an experience, it's like you shift to a deeper recognition of presence or something, and still the trauma comes back. So it's like preaching to the choir though with you guys, because you're here because you already get it. Send this video to people who haven't quite gotten this yet, who are still struggling on the path. Even though the video is about addiction, it's really just about suffering. It's about the things that keep us from embodying freedom, keep us from recovering, keep us from a life of joy and freedom and peace, like true joy, freedom, and peace. What stands in the way? Sometimes what's standing in the way is this stuff right here that we're talking about. So imagine those friends that you have that keep going to retreats and they haven't been listening to you. You're trying to tell them that the body keeps the score and that part of the reason that they're struggling is because something isn't resolved. Send them this, especially if they have addictions, because maybe they'll connect the dots for the first time. You guys have already connected the dots, and that's why you're here. And thank God there are people like you out there who, so I'm not just talking to myself. Yeah, good comments. Some, so someone said sometimes the departure of people can be a really deeply beautiful experience. Totally. In fact, that's actually part of the falling away, isn't it? When you realize that you don't really need people in the way that you used to, or that someone leaves your life, and it actually helps in the process of waking up from that attachment or whatever else. That is definitely something that goes on. But what I'm talking about is even before we get to that, if we're not aware of the ways in which we're already disconnected from people. So sometimes we're letting go of people that where the relationship came from disconnection anyway. You follow me? So here is an invitation to explore that disconnection in the body. And then if through exploring that a relationship falls away, that's fine. But a lot of times I think people are letting go of other people in relationship because they can't connect with them. You see, you feel not safe around them or not good enough, and that's just more of the same disconnection. So I'm pointing to something else here, where we're not letting go of people simply because they reinforce our stories. We let go of people when it's time to let go of people, not from the disconnection though as much. I don't know if I'm being clear there. Well, let me say it this way. If I have a deficiency story that I can't trust people, the letting go of a bunch of people would just be the reinforcement of the story. So I don't trust people, so he has to go, and now she has to go. And that's a beautiful falling away because I don't have to deal with that anymore. But does that get to the root of the distrust? You see, that's something for inquiry, I think. Serena asked what disconnection referred to with self and other people. It's actually a disconnection from, it's separation. It's a disconnection from other people, from self, from awareness. You're disconnected in every way. Yes. So it's not either or, it's all of that, just disconnection. Some people say the disconnection from source. Sounds good. It's a nice way of saying it. Also disconnection from others. Right, Carolyn, so now that you get the tip of the iceberg is ready to learn this stuff. Oops, sorry, it's so loud. What startles me every time, I put it on silence, I think, and then I don't. It's like, okay, so I've just got a couple minutes here. Let me see if there's anything else to comment on. Oh, gosh, you would ask that right before I'm leaving, Carolyn. I have to say something about that. Um, I've heard over and over to focus on the positive, that if you look at shadow and trauma, you will only get more of it. Oh my gosh. No, 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 no. How does that get perpetrated? You don't get more of it if you're looking at it skillfully, because with skillful inquiry, it deconstructs the trauma. So you actually don't get more of it, you get less of it. So that's absolutely incorrect. It's the opposite of good inquiry work, getting more of it. And here's the other thing, focusing on the positive represses the negative. And we know that repression is behind a lot of this seeking. So that statement couldn't even be more inaccurate. This whole thing, focus on the positive, this is going to die out in spirituality eventually, I think. When people start reading the science behind repression, they're not going to do that anymore. But these are not science or evidence-based practices. They're some of these practices that focus on the positive. There's not a ton of evidence to support that, and there's a lot of evidence that says repression in that way is very detrimental to our health. So there's so much more to say about that. But look, how am I going to truly find intimacy and authenticity and deep union with others if I don't go to the trauma? Because it's the trauma that disconnects me. So those stories in our body that say I'm not safe, I can't trust people, they don't love me, whatever, those have to be dealt with. That trauma has to be dealt with, or else you're going to expect more disconnection, because that's what trauma and deficiency stories do. So if anyone tells you to focus on the positive, point them to the studies that say repressing negative is very bad for us. And then talk about trauma and how trauma itself is disconnecting, and it affects relationships, it affects our well being. Disconnection can lead to addiction. Disconnection can lead to more spiritual seeking, more self improvement. Definitely go to the trauma of disconnection. Do it skillfully, though. If you do it skillfully, you don't get more of it, you get less. It falls away. If you don't do it skillfully, I wouldn't do it at all. I would not go into trauma if I didn't know how to deal with it once it's up. So that part of that statement feels correct. It's like you're going to get more of it if you don't know what you're doing. But if you learn the Kilby inquiries and you work with somebody, at least in the beginning on the trauma, you've got a shot at it where you won't get more of it. Those studies on repression, I have a bunch of studies listed in my Facebook, on my Facebook, Scott Kilby Facebook page. They're connected to one particular video. I may repost those because I haven't posted them in a while. So just be looking. If I can remember, I'll post the studies on repression and dysregulation. Essentially, emotional stuff becomes a major contributing factor for many mental health and physical health issues. I'll post that.